November 14th, 1967. The monsoon clouds hung over the central highlands of South Vietnam like gray shrouds, their bellies swollen with rain that fell in sheets across the jungle canopy. At Korat Royal Thai Air Force Base, 200 miles to the west, the morning briefing room buzzed with the controlled tension that preceded every Wild Weasel mission. Captain Richard Hawk Pearson adjusted his survival vest and studied the intelligence photographs spread across the metal table. The images showed nothing but green jungle, but hidden beneath that canopy lay something far more dangerous than any visible enemy. The Republic F-105F Thunderchief, designation Wild Weasel, sat on the tarmac like a predatory bird. Its sleek fuselage stretched 64 feet from nose to tail, housing a Pratt & Whitney J75 turbojet engine capable of pushing the aircraft past Mach 2. But speed was not what made this plane special. What distinguished the Wild Weasel from every other fighter bomber in the Air Force inventory was its electronic warfare suite. The AN/APR-25 and AN/APR-26 radar warning receivers, the QRC-259 electronic countermeasures pod, and most importantly, the ability to carry AGM-45 Shrike missiles specifically designed to follow radio frequency emissions back to their source. The Wild Weasel program had been born from desperation. By late 1967, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces had established an increasingly sophisticated air defense network throughout South Vietnam, supported by Soviet advisors and equipment. SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missiles, radar-guided ZSU-23-4 anti-aircraft guns, and mobile early warning radars had turned previously safe air corridors into killing fields. American pilots flying close air support missions for ground troops found themselves flying into carefully orchestrated traps, guided by radar operators who could track aircraft from dozens of miles away. The concept was elegantly simple and terrifyingly dangerous. Fly directly toward enemy radar installations, absorb their electronic emissions, and destroy them with specialized missiles. The unofficial motto of the Wild Weasel crews captured the suicidal nature of their mission. YGBSM, you gotta be shitting me. But on this gray November morning, as Pearson performed his pre-flight inspection, the mission carried additional urgency. For 3 days, the 173rd Airborne Brigade had been fighting for their lives on Hills 823 and 875 near Dak To, a remote outpost in Kon Tum Province. The paratroopers, surrounded and outnumbered, depended entirely on air support for survival. Helicopter medevac flights, supply drops, and close air support sorties all required clear flight paths through enemy-controlled airspace. Every active radar site represented dozens of American lives hanging in the balance. The intelligence briefing had been stark in its assessment. Soviet-supplied P-12 spoon rest early warning radars and fire can gun-laying radars had been positioned throughout the Dak Pek Valley, creating an overlapping web of electronic surveillance that made low-altitude flight missions nearly impossible. These were not crude, improvised weapons. The P-12 could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles, while the fire can radars could guide anti-aircraft artillery with lethal precision. More troubling still, American electronic intelligence had detected the distinctive emissions signature of SA-2 guideline missiles, suggesting that mobile surface-to-air missile batteries had been moved into the area. The North Vietnamese had learned to use the jungle itself as camouflage for their electronic warfare capabilities. Radar antennas were concealed beneath triple canopy forest, power cables were buried along animal trails, and missile launchers were positioned in natural clearings that appeared empty from aerial reconnaissance. The monsoon weather provided additional cover, as heavy rain and low clouds limited the effectiveness of visual surveillance flights. Captain Pearson's wingman for this mission was First Lieutenant Michael Gunner Garrison, a 24-year-old pilot from Texas who had volunteered for Wild Weasel duty after completing 2 tours flying F-105D fighter bombers over North Vietnam. Garrison's aircraft carried the same electronic detection equipment, but his primary responsibility would be to provide cover fire while Pearson engaged the radar targets. Both pilots understood that their survival depended on split-second timing, perfect coordination, and a substantial measure of luck. The tactical approach required entering enemy airspace at extremely low altitude to avoid early detection, then climbing rapidly when hostile radar emissions were detected to launch Shrike missiles from optimal range. The AGM-45 Shrike weighed approximately 400 pounds and carried a conventional warhead designed to detonate when it detected the specific radio frequency signature it had been programmed to target. Once launched, the missile would follow the radar beam back to its source, theoretically destroying the antenna and associated equipment. But theory and reality in the electronic warfare environment over Vietnam often diverged dramatically. Experienced North Vietnamese radar operators had developed countermeasures of their own, including shutting down their equipment immediately after missile launch to break the guidance lock, operating multiple radars in sequence to confuse targeting systems, and positioning dummy antennas to attract American missiles while keeping the real equipment hidden nearby. At 0630 hours, both F-105F aircraft lifted off from Korat, their afterburners painting orange flames against the pre-dawn darkness. The flight path took them northeast across the Mekong River into Laos, then southeast toward the contested area around Dak To. The early morning sky was deceptively peaceful, with scattered cumulus clouds drifting over the endless green carpet of jungle below. But Pearson knew that this tranquility was an illusion. Somewhere beneath that verdant canopy, Soviet-trained technicians were already tracking their approach. The first electronic warning came at 0647 hours when Pearson's APR-25 receiver detected a weak signal on the P-band frequency typically associated with early warning radars. The signal was intermittent, suggesting that the operators were using brief transmission bursts to avoid detection while still maintaining surveillance coverage. Pearson keyed his radio to inform Garrison of the contact, using the coded language that had become standard for Wild Weasel missions. The landscape below began to change as they approached the target area. The solid jungle canopy gave way to more broken terrain, with exposed ridgelines and valleys that showed the scars of previous bombing campaigns. Smoke columns rose from several locations, marking the positions where American artillery and airstrikes had attempted to suppress enemy positions. The monsoon weather was moving in from the east, bringing with it the promise of reduced visibility and increasingly dangerous flying conditions. At 0652 hours, the electronic warfare environment exploded into activity. Pearson's threat warning receivers simultaneously detected multiple radar signatures: the distinctive sweep pattern of a fire can gun-laying radar, the broader search beam of a P-12 early warning system, and, most ominously, the narrow beam acquisition signal of an SA-2 missile guidance system. The overlapping electronic emissions created a cacophony of audio warnings in his headset, each tone representing a different threat requiring immediate tactical response. The enemy had waited until both American aircraft were committed to their attack run before activating their full radar array. This was a carefully orchestrated ambush, designed to overwhelm the Wild Weasel crews with multiple simultaneous threats while limiting their escape options. Pearson realized that he and Garrison had flown directly into what electronic warfare specialists called a radar trap, a coordinated defense network designed specifically to destroy aircraft like theirs. But the Wild Weasel crews had trained extensively for exactly this scenario. Without hesitation, Pearson began the complex sequence of actions required to engage multiple radar targets while avoiding incoming fire. His first priority was to identify the most dangerous threat, in this case, the SA-2 guidance radar that would direct surface-to-air missiles toward his aircraft. The APR-26 receiver provided bearing and approximate range information, allowing him to determine the optimal attack angle for Shrike missile employment. The valley floor erupted in a storm of anti-aircraft fire as North Vietnamese gunners opened up with everything they had. Streams of green tracers arced upward through the humid air, creating deadly spiderwebs of intersecting fire that filled the sky around both F-105 aircraft. The distinctive sound of 37mm automatic cannons echoed off the surrounding hills, their explosive shells detonating in angry black puffs that rocked both planes with violent turbulence. Garrison's voice crackled through the radio static. "Hawk, I've got tone on a fire can at 2 o'clock. Request permission to engage." The procedural language barely concealed the urgency of their situation. Both pilots could see the white contrail of an SA-2 missile climbing toward them from somewhere in the jungle below, its guidance system locked onto their aircraft signatures. The next 30 seconds would determine whether they lived or died. Pearson rolled his F-105F into a steep climbing turn, presenting the smallest possible radar cross-section to the approaching missile, while simultaneously positioning for a Shrike launch against the SA-2 guidance radar. His aircraft's electronic countermeasures pod automatically began broadcasting jamming signals designed to confuse incoming missiles, but he knew that success against the SA-2 required precise timing and flawless execution. The surface-to-air missile passed less than 50 feet below Pearson's aircraft, its proximity fuse failing to detonate due to the electronic jamming, but the explosion of the missile's rocket motor had damaged his aircraft's hydraulic system, causing warning lights to illuminate across his instrument panel. Fluid pressure was dropping rapidly, which would make the F-105F increasingly difficult to control as the mission progressed. Despite the battle damage, Pearson pressed his attack. At a range of 8 miles, he launched his first Shrike missile toward the SA-2 guidance radar. The AGM-45 separated from its wing pylon with a brilliant flash of its solid rocket motor, streaking downward through the humid air toward its electronic target. For 18 seconds, the missile followed the radar emissions with mechanical precision, its seeker head locked onto the specific frequency signature of the Soviet-built guidance system. The explosion that erupted from the jungle floor confirmed a direct hit. A secondary blast followed immediately, suggesting that the Shrike had detonated near stored missile fuel or warheads. A column of black smoke rose above the tree line, and most significantly, the electronic emissions from the SA-2 site ceased entirely. The radar that had been guiding surface-to-air missiles against American aircraft was permanently silent. But the victory came at a cost. Garrison's F-105F had been bracketed by 57mm anti-aircraft fire while covering Pearson's attack run. One shell had exploded directly beneath his aircraft, shredding the vertical stabilizer and severing critical control cables. Garrison fought to maintain control as his plane began an uncontrollable roll toward the jungle below. The young pilot's final radio transmission was calm and professional. "Hawk, I'm going in. Take care of the fire can radar. Get our boys home." His F-105F disappeared into the triple canopy forest in an orange fireball that sent a mushroom of smoke and flame hundreds of feet into the air. There would be no parachute, no rescue beacon, no miraculous survival story. First Lieutenant Michael Garrison had paid the ultimate price in the invisible war between electronics and human courage. Pearson was now alone over enemy territory, flying a damaged aircraft with limited hydraulic pressure and fuel reserves rapidly depleting due to battle damage. The smart tactical decision would have been to withdraw immediately, but the fire can gun-laying radar was still active somewhere below, still guiding anti-aircraft fire against American helicopters attempting to evacuate wounded paratroopers from Hills 823 and 875. The electronic warfare officer's training took precedence over personal survival. Pearson located the fire can emissions with his APR-25 receiver and began another attack run, despite knowing that he was now the sole target for every anti-aircraft weapon in the valley. Green tracers converged on his aircraft from multiple directions as enemy gunners concentrated their fire on the lone American fighter. His second Shrike missile launch was textbook perfect. The AGM-45 tracked directly to the fire can radar installation, detonating in a spectacular explosion that sent radar antenna fragments spinning through the jungle air. The distinctive rotating search pattern that had been painting American aircraft with targeting information vanished from the electromagnetic spectrum, leaving only empty silence where deadly precision had existed moments before. But Pearson's aircraft was dying around him. The hydraulic pressure had dropped to zero, making the flight controls increasingly unresponsive. Fuel was streaming from multiple punctures in his internal tanks, leaving a visible vapor trail that marked his position for enemy gunners. The Pratt & Whitney engine was running rough, probably damaged by shell fragments or debris ingestion during the low-altitude attack runs. The young captain faced a decision that thousands of American aircrew would confront during the Vietnam War: attempt to nurse a crippled aircraft back to friendly territory, or eject over enemy-controlled jungle and hope for rescue. The nearest American base was over 100 miles away, across terrain controlled by North Vietnamese regulars who had standing orders to capture downed American pilots for interrogation and propaganda purposes. Pearson chose to fly. Mile by agonizing mile, he coaxed his F-105F westward toward the Laotian border, trading altitude for distance as his engine gradually lost power. The monsoon weather that had provided cover for the enemy radar installations now worked in his favor, as low clouds concealed his aircraft from visual detection by ground observers. But the same weather that hit him also made navigation increasingly difficult, as familiar landmarks disappeared beneath the gray overcast. At 07:34 hours, flying at barely 2,000 feet above the jungle canopy, Pearson's engine finally quit. The sudden silence was profound after hours of turbine whine and radio chatter. His F-105F became a 30,000-pound glider, trading airspeed for time as he searched desperately for a suitable place to eject. The jungle below offered no clearings, no roads, no hint of civilization, only an endless carpet of green that would swallow him without a trace. The ejection sequence functioned perfectly despite the battle damage. Martin Baker, ejection seat 6A, fired Pearson clear of his disintegrating aircraft at precisely the right moment, his parachute deploying automatically as the F-105F cartwheeled into the trees below. He watched his plane disappear in a gout of flame and smoke, taking with it $7 million of American technology and months of specialized training. Captain Pearson descended through the humid air toward an uncertain fate. His survival vest contained water purification tablets, emergency rations, a compact radio beacon, and a .38 caliber revolver with 18 rounds of ammunition, minimal equipment for survival in a jungle controlled by enemy forces actively searching for downed American pilots. The parachute caught in the forest canopy 40 feet above the ground, leaving him suspended in a green twilight world of twisted vines and exotic bird calls. For 3 days and nights, Pearson evaded capture while rescue forces attempted to locate his position. His survival beacon transmitted intermittently to avoid detection by enemy direction-finding equipment, providing just enough signal for American search and rescue aircraft to maintain a general bearing toward his location. He moved constantly, following small streams and animal trails, while avoiding any signs of human habitation that might indicate enemy patrol routes. The jungle was a living entity that seemed determined to kill him through exhaustion, dehydration, and infection. Leeches attached themselves to every exposed area of skin. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds so thick that breathing became difficult. His emergency rations lasted less than 24 hours, forcing him to survive on whatever edible plants and insects he could identify from his survival training. But most dangerous of all were the North Vietnamese search teams that combed the area methodically, using tracking dogs and local guides who knew every trail and stream. Twice, enemy patrols passed within 50 yards of his hiding position. He could hear their voices discussing search patterns and coordinates, their equipment clattering as they moved through the undergrowth. Discovery would mean capture, interrogation, and years of imprisonment under conditions that had already broken dozens of American airmen. On November 17th, a Navy SH-3A Sea King helicopter from the carrier USS Intrepid finally located Pearson's position using electronic triangulation equipment. The rescue was conducted under heavy fire from North Vietnamese forces who had also detected the survival beacon transmissions. Marine Corps AH-1G Cobra gunships provided covering fire while the Sea King descended through the forest canopy on a steel cable rescue hoist. Captain Pearson was unconscious from exhaustion and dehydration when the Navy rescue swimmer reached him. His survival vest had been shredded by thorns and branches during 3 days of constant movement. Multiple infected wounds covered his arms and legs, and he had lost nearly 20 pounds from his already lean frame. But he was alive, and more importantly, he had successfully completed his mission. The electronic intelligence reports filed after Operation Red Crown confirmed the destruction of both targeted radar installations. The SA-2 missile site never resumed operations, its Soviet-built equipment reduced to twisted metal by the Shrike missile's precision guidance system. The Fire-Can gun-laying radar was similarly obliterated, its antenna array scattered across several acres of jungle floor. Most significantly, American helicopter operations in the Dak 2 area immediately improved, with medevac flights reporting dramatic reductions in radar-guided anti-aircraft fire. But the human cost of this electronic victory was soberly tallied in the classified after-action reports. First Lieutenant Michael Garrison was officially listed as killed in action. His body never recovered from the jungle crash site. Captain Richard Pearson was evacuated to Clark Air Base in the Philippines for medical treatment, then returned to the United States for an extended period of physical and psychological rehabilitation. His wild Weasel career was over, ended by injuries and trauma that would affect him for the remainder of his life. The F-105 Thunder Chief that had carried him through the electronic gauntlet was completely destroyed, adding to the growing toll of American aircraft lost to increasingly sophisticated enemy air defenses. The two AGM-45 Shrike missiles had cost American taxpayers over $60,000 each, not including the research and development expenses required to create weapons capable of following radio waves back to their source. Yet for the paratroopers of the 173rd Airborne Brigade, fighting desperate battles on Hills 823 and 875, the Wild Weasel mission represented nothing less than salvation. Helicopter medevac crews reported an immediate and dramatic improvement in their ability to reach wounded soldiers, with radar-guided anti-aircraft fire reduced by over 80% in the days following the radar destruction. Supply flights resumed normal operations, allowing ammunition and medical supplies to reach the embattled infantry units that had been cut off for days. The invisible nature of electronic warfare meant that most American ground troops never understood how their air support had been restored. They knew only that the deadly accurate anti-aircraft fire that had been shooting down their medevac helicopters had suddenly and mysteriously ceased. The young men bleeding in foxholes on remote hilltops never learned the names of the Wild Weasel crews who had died to clear the skies above their heads. Operation Red Crown represented both the promise and the paradox of technological warfare in Vietnam. American electronic systems had proven capable of detecting, tracking, and destroying enemy radar installations with unprecedented precision. The AGM-45 Shrike missile had functioned exactly as designed, following electromagnetic emissions through dense jungle canopy to eliminate threats that conventional bombing had been unable to locate. But this technological superiority came at enormous cost in human terms. The Wild Weasel crews flew the most dangerous missions in the most dangerous aircraft, deliberately attracting enemy fire in order to locate and destroy radar installations. Their unofficial motto, "First in, last out," reflected the suicidal nature of missions that required flying directly toward the most heavily defended targets in enemy territory. The psychological toll on Wild Weasel aircrew was immense. These pilots and electronic warfare officers knew that their survival depended on equipment that could fail without warning, missiles that might not guide properly, and tactics that required split-second timing under extreme combat stress. Many developed what flight surgeons diagnosed as radar paranoia, an obsessive focus on electronic threat indicators that made normal flying increasingly difficult. Captain Pearson's medical records from Clark Air Base documented symptoms that would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic insomnia, hypervigilance, recurring nightmares about electronic warning tones, and severe anxiety when exposed to any form of radar equipment. The invisible wounds of electronic warfare proved as debilitating as physical injuries, requiring months of careful treatment to restore basic psychological stability. The broader strategic implications of Wild Weasel operations extended far beyond individual missions or tactical victories. The program represented America's first systematic attempt to wage warfare in the electromagnetic spectrum, using electronic detection and precision-guided weapons to neutralize enemy advantages in terrain and camouflage. This approach would eventually evolve into the comprehensive electronic warfare capabilities that dominated later conflicts. But in 1967, it remained experimental and extremely dangerous. Soviet military advisors in North Vietnam quickly recognized the threat posed by American electronic warfare capabilities. Within months of Operation Red Crown, they had developed new tactics for radar operations that included frequent frequency changes, mobile deployment patterns, and sophisticated electronic countermeasures designed to defeat Shrike missile guidance systems. The technological arms race between American precision weapons and Soviet defensive systems would continue throughout the remainder of the Vietnam War. The North Vietnamese response to Wild Weasel operations demonstrated their tactical flexibility and technological sophistication. Rather than abandoning radar-controlled air defenses, they adapted their employment techniques to minimize vulnerability to American electronic warfare attacks. Radar operators learned to use brief transmission periods, multiple frequency shifts, and coordinated shutdown procedures that could break missile guidance locks while maintaining surveillance coverage. Perhaps most significantly, the success of Operation Red Crown validated the basic concept of electronic warfare as a decisive factor in modern military operations. The ability to detect, locate, and destroy enemy radar installations had immediate and measurable impact on American air operations throughout South Vietnam. Helicopter crews reported dramatic improvements in mission success rates, while fixed-wing aircraft experienced substantial reductions in surface-to-air missile encounters. But victory in the electronic warfare domain required constant vigilance and continuous technological advancement. Each successful Wild Weasel mission provided enemy forces with information about American electronic warfare capabilities, forcing continuous modifications to equipment and tactics. The invisible war between radar operators and Wild Weasel crews became increasingly sophisticated, as both sides developed new methods for achieving electromagnetic superiority. The human dimension of this technological conflict remained paramount. No amount of electronic sophistication could eliminate the need for skilled aircrew willing to fly directly toward the most dangerous targets in enemy territory. The Wild Weasel program succeeded because pilots like Captain Pearson and Lieutenant Garrison possessed the courage to engage enemy radar sites at point-blank range, knowing that detection meant almost certain death. The weather itself became both ally and enemy in electronic warfare operations. The monsoon conditions that characterized much of the fighting in Southeast Asia affected radar propagation, missile guidance systems, and aircraft performance in complex ways that required constant tactical adaptation. Wild Weasel crews learned to exploit atmospheric conditions that could mask their approach or confuse enemy tracking systems, while remaining vulnerable to weather-related equipment failures that could prove fatal during critical mission phases. Training for Wild Weasel operations required months of intensive instruction in electronic warfare theory, radar principles, and specialized equipment operation. Pilots and electronic warfare officers attended classified courses that covered the technical characteristics of Soviet-built radar systems, the flight profiles required for optimal Shrike missile employment, and survival techniques specific to electronic warfare missions deep in enemy territory. The selection process for Wild Weasel crews emphasized psychological stability, technical aptitude, and demonstrated courage under extreme stress. Volunteers underwent extensive screening that included psychological evaluation, technical testing, and rigorous flight training designed to simulate the conditions they would encounter over enemy territory. The program's high casualty rate meant that replacement aircrew required constant training and rapid deployment to operational units. Captain Pearson's recovery at Clark Air Base followed protocols developed specifically for aircrew who had survived extended periods of evasion in enemy territory. Military psychiatrists had learned that the combination of combat stress, survival challenges, and uncertainty about rescue created unique psychological trauma that required specialized treatment approaches. The integration of physical rehabilitation with psychological counseling reflected growing recognition of the total nature of modern warfare's impact on human beings. The technological legacy of Operation Red Crown extended far beyond the Vietnam conflict. The electronic warfare techniques developed by Wild Weasel crews became the foundation for precision-guided weapons systems that would dominate subsequent military operations. The basic principle of following electromagnetic emissions back to their source evolved into increasingly sophisticated guidance systems that could discriminate between different types of radar emissions and select the most tactically significant targets. American defense contractors used data collected from Wild Weasel missions to develop improved electronic warfare equipment, better missile guidance systems, and more effective countermeasures against enemy radar installations. The knowledge gained from hundreds of electronic warfare missions in Southeast Asia directly contributed to the technological superiority that American forces would demonstrate in later conflicts throughout the world. But perhaps the most significant legacy of missions like Operation Red Crown was the recognition that modern warfare had fundamentally changed character. The traditional concepts of front lines, secure rear areas, and conventional battlefield tactics had given way to a new form of conflict where electromagnetic dominance was as important as control of physical terrain. The invisible war fought by Wild Weasel crews represented the future of military operations in an increasingly technological world. The moral complexity of electronic warfare operations reflected broader questions about the nature of modern conflict and the human cost of technological advancement. Wild Weasel crews engaged enemy radar installations not for territorial gain or strategic advantage, but to protect American ground troops who depended on air support for survival. Their missions exemplified the interconnected nature of modern military operations, where success in one domain directly affected outcomes in all others. The jungle around Dak, to eventually reclaim the sites where Captain Pearson and Lieutenant Garrison had fought their electronic battle against Soviet-built radar installations. Monsoon rains washed away the debris from destroyed equipment, while tropical vegetation concealed the crater marks left by exploding Shrike missiles. Within months, no physical evidence remained of the technological duel that had determined the fate of American ground troops fighting on distant hilltops. Yet the invisible nature of this victory did not diminish its significance. The electromagnetic spectrum over South Vietnam had been claimed by American electronic warfare capabilities, opening secure flight corridors that saved thousands of lives during the remainder of the Vietnam conflict. Helicopter crews flying medevac missions, supply flights, and troop insertions rarely understood that their safety depended on the sacrifice of aircrew they would never meet, flying aircraft they would never see, fighting battles that left no visible trace. The strategic implications of electronic warfare superiority extended far beyond immediate tactical advantages. Control of the electromagnetic spectrum affected enemy communications, intelligence gathering, and coordination capabilities in ways that were difficult to measure but critically important to overall military effectiveness. Wild Weasel operations disrupted the information networks that enemy forces required to conduct coordinated operations against American ground troops. Today, veterans of the Wild Weasel program gather annually to remember the aircrew who died fighting the invisible war over Southeast Asia. Their reunions are subdued affairs, marked by the knowledge that their technical victories came at enormous human cost. The names of pilots and electronic warfare officers killed in action are read aloud, each representing a life lost in the pursuit of electromagnetic dominance over an enemy who understood the strategic importance of the invisible battlefield. The declassified records of Operation Red Crown and hundreds of similar missions provide insight into an aspect of the Vietnam War that remained largely unknown to the American public. While news reports focused on ground combat and conventional air operations, the electronic warfare specialists fought their own desperate battles against sophisticated enemy air defense systems that threatened every American aircraft operating over Southeast Asia. The technological sophistication of these invisible battles challenges common perceptions about the nature of conflict during the Vietnam era. Rather than a primitive guerrilla war fought with small arms and improvised weapons, the struggle for electromagnetic dominance involved some of the most advanced military technology available to either side. Soviet radar systems, American precision-guided missiles, and electronic warfare equipment represented the cutting edge of military science applied to the ancient problem of defeating enemy defenses. But ultimately, the effectiveness of all this technology depended on human beings willing to risk their lives in pursuit of tactical advantages that might save the lives of other human beings they would never meet. The courage required to fly directly toward enemy radar installations, knowing that detection meant almost certain death, represents a form of heroism that transcended national boundaries or political ideologies. Captain Richard Pearson returned to civilian life in 1969, carrying physical and psychological wounds that would affect him for the remainder of his life. He never spoke publicly about his Wild Weasel missions, honoring the classified nature of electronic warfare operations that remained sensitive long after the end of American involvement in Southeast Asia. His military records, sealed for decades under national security classifications, were finally declassified in the 1990s, allowing historians to reconstruct the full story of his contribution to the invisible war. First Lieutenant Michael Garrison's body was never recovered from the jungle crash site where his F-105F Thunder Chief had been destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. His name is inscribed on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. Among the 58,000 Americans who died during the conflict, his family received his posthumous Purple Heart and Distinguished Flying Cross in a quiet ceremony that made no mention of the classified nature of his final mission. The electronic warfare techniques pioneered by Wild Weasel crews during the Vietnam War evolved into comprehensive systems that would dominate military operations for decades to come. The basic principle of detecting, tracking, and destroying enemy radar installations became standard doctrine for air forces throughout the world. The invisible victories achieved by pilots like Pearson and Garrison established American superiority in the electromagnetic spectrum that continues to influence military operations today. Yet the human cost of achieving this technological dominance should not be forgotten or minimized. Every advance in electronic warfare capability was purchased with the lives of aircrew who volunteered for missions that combined maximum danger with minimum recognition. Their sacrifice enabled innovations that would save thousands of lives in future conflicts. But this utilitarian calculation cannot diminish the personal tragedy represented by each name on memorial walls. The monsoon rains still fall over the central highlands of Vietnam, washing the jungle floors where American and North Vietnamese forces once fought desperate battles for control of hilltops, whose names are remembered only by the men who bled to capture or defend them. The radar installations that once guided deadly accurate anti-aircraft fire have long since been dismantled or destroyed, their electronic emissions silenced forever by the passage of time and the end of the war they were created to fight. But in the memories of the men who survived those battles, the invisible war continues. Veterans of wild weasel operations still wake to the sound of radar warning tones that existed only in their dreams. The electronic signatures that once meant life or death during missions over enemy territory have been burned into memory with traumatic permanence that no amount of time can erase. The technological legacy of Operation Red Crown and similar electronic warfare missions extends far beyond military applications. The precision guidance systems developed for anti-radiation missiles eventually found civilian applications in satellite communications, GPS navigation, and cellular telephone networks. The electronic warfare techniques that saved lives during the Vietnam conflict contributed to technological advances that benefit millions of people around the world. How many helicopter medevac crews returned safely to base because Wild Weasel aircraft had silenced the radars that would have guided surface-to-air missiles toward their aircraft? How many wounded soldiers reached medical treatment because electronic warfare specialists had cleared the skies above emergency landing zones? The precise numbers will never be known, but the strategic impact of electromagnetic dominance can be measured in thousands of lives saved and missions accomplished. The invisible nature of electronic warfare means that most of its victories remain unknown to the general public. Unlike conventional military operations that produce visible results in the form of captured territory or destroyed installations, electronic warfare success is measured in enemy capabilities that cease to function, communications that are disrupted, and missiles that fail to find their targets. The absence of enemy action often indicates the most successful electronic warfare operations. This invisibility has made it difficult for the public to understand or appreciate the significance of electronic warfare contributions to military success. The crews who flew Wild Weasel missions received little recognition during the war and even less acknowledgement afterward. Their classified missions could not be discussed publicly, their tactical victories could not be celebrated openly, and their casualties were recorded in statistics that revealed nothing about the nature of their sacrifice. Today, as military historians gain access to declassified documents and interview surviving veterans, a more complete picture emerges of the electronic warfare campaigns that were conducted simultaneously with more visible aspects of the Vietnam conflict. These invisible battles were as critical to American military operations as any conventional engagement, determining the effectiveness of air support that ground troops depended upon for survival. The courage required to volunteer for Wild Weasel missions reflected a unique form of military service that combined the individual risk acceptance of fighter pilots with the technical expertise of electronic warfare specialists. These aircrew understood that their survival depended not only on flying skill and tactical judgment, but also on their ability to interpret complex electronic signals, operate sophisticated detection equipment, and employ precision-guided weapons under extreme combat conditions. The training required to produce effective Wild Weasel crews represented a significant investment in human capital that was lost each time an aircraft was shot down or a crew member was killed in action. The specialized knowledge required for electronic warfare operations could not be quickly replaced, making each casualty a significant reduction in overall capability. The program's high attrition rate meant that training new crews became as important as conducting operational missions. The technological arms race that characterized electronic warfare during the Vietnam era established patterns of innovation and counter-innovation that continue to influence military development today. Each successful Wild Weasel mission provided enemy forces with information about American electronic warfare capabilities, forcing continuous modifications to equipment and tactics. The pace of technological change accelerated throughout the conflict as both sides sought to gain decisive advantages in the electromagnetic spectrum. The psychological pressure of electronic warfare operations was unique among military specialties. Wild Weasel crews faced the constant possibility that their aircraft's electronic emissions were being monitored by enemy forces, potentially revealing their position and mission intent. This knowledge created a form of paranoia that was both necessary for mission success and destructive to personal psychological health. The strategic implications of American electronic warfare superiority extended far beyond the Southeast Asian theater of operations. The techniques and equipment developed for Wild Weasel missions provided intelligence about Soviet radar systems and electronic warfare capabilities that would prove valuable during subsequent Cold War confrontations. The knowledge gained from combat operations in Vietnam directly contributed to American military advantages that would persist for decades. But the immediate tactical impact of electronic warfare operations like Operation Red Crown was measured in much simpler terms. American aircraft could fly their missions with reduced risk of surface-to-air missile attack. Helicopter crews could evacuate wounded soldiers without facing radar-guided anti-aircraft fire, and ground troops could receive the air support they needed to survive in combat against numerically superior enemy forces. The moral mathematics of these operations were stark and unforgiving. 2 American aircrew and 1 expensive aircraft were lost in exchange for the destruction of 2 enemy radar installations and the temporary suppression of air defense coverage over a critical battle area. From a purely utilitarian perspective, this trade ratio was favorable, as the restored air support capability saved far more lives than were lost during the electronic warfare mission itself. Yet such calculations cannot capture the full human cost of these invisible victories. Lieutenant Garrison's death represented not just the loss of a skilled pilot, but the end of a young man's dreams, the destruction of a family's future, and the elimination of potential contributions he might have made to society during a full lifetime. The strategic value of his sacrifice cannot be measured solely in terms of tactical advantages gained or enemy capabilities destroyed. Captain Pearson's survival came at the price of physical and psychological wounds that would affect him for the remainder of his life. The invisible injuries caused by extended combat stress, survival ordeals, and repeated exposure to life-threatening situations were as real and debilitating as any physical wound. The technology that enabled his electronic warfare missions could not protect him from the human cost of employing that technology in combat. The jungle environment of Southeast Asia added another layer of complexity to electronic warfare operations. The high humidity, frequent rainfall, and dense vegetation affected radio wave propagation in ways that could interfere with both detection equipment and missile guidance systems. Wild Weasel crews learned to compensate for atmospheric conditions that could cause equipment failures at critical moments during combat operations. The maintenance requirements for electronic warfare equipment were enormous, reflecting the sophisticated nature of systems that had to function reliably under extreme environmental conditions. Ground crews worked around the clock to keep Wild Weasel aircraft operational, knowing that equipment failures during combat missions inevitably resulted in aircrew deaths. The logistics chain required to support electronic warfare operations extended from air bases in Thailand to defense contractors in the United States. The intelligence value of Wild Weasel missions extended far beyond their immediate tactical impact. Each encounter with enemy radar systems provided valuable information about Soviet equipment capabilities, employment techniques, and electronic warfare countermeasures. This intelligence was carefully analyzed by American technical specialists who used it to develop improved detection equipment and more effective offensive systems. The international implications of electronic warfare operations were carefully managed by American military and diplomatic officials, who recognized that some aspects of these missions could provoke broader conflicts. The use of precision-guided weapons against radar installations demonstrated American technological capabilities in ways that sent clear messages to both allies and potential adversaries around the world. The evolution of Wild Weasel tactics throughout the Vietnam conflict reflected the dynamic nature of electronic warfare, where successful techniques quickly became obsolete as enemy forces developed countermeasures. The missions required constant adaptation, innovation, and tactical flexibility from aircrew who understood that survival depended on staying ahead of enemy defensive improvements. Today, the electronic warfare systems that evolved from wild weasel operations during the Vietnam War have become routine components of military operations around the world. Modern precision-guided weapons, sophisticated detection systems, and comprehensive electronic warfare suites can trace their development directly to the combat experiences of pilots like Captain Pearson and Lieutenant Garrison. But the fundamental challenge of electronic warfare remains unchanged. Human beings must still make life-or-death decisions about engaging enemy systems, operating complex equipment under extreme stress, and accepting enormous personal risks to achieve tactical advantages that may save the lives of other human beings they will never meet. The invisible war fought in the electromagnetic spectrum above Vietnam established principles and precedents that continue to influence military doctrine, weapons development, and tactical employment of electronic warfare systems. The courage displayed by wild weasel crews during missions like Operation Red Crown created a legacy of professionalism and sacrifice that continues to inspire electronic warfare specialists serving in conflicts around the world. In the end, the most significant lesson from Operation Red Crown may be that technological superiority, no matter how sophisticated or decisive, ultimately depends on human beings willing to risk their lives in service of larger causes. The electronic warfare capabilities that proved so effective during the Vietnam conflict existed only because pilots and electronic warfare officers possessed the courage to employ them under conditions that combined maximum danger with minimal recognition. The names of the aircrew who died flying wild weasel missions are engraved in granite and bronze at memorial sites around the world, permanent reminders of the human cost of achieving technological dominance in modern warfare. Their sacrifice enabled innovations that would save thousands of lives in future conflicts, a legacy that transcends the immediate tactical victories achieved during their final missions. As you reflect on these stories of courage in the invisible war fought above Vietnam's jungles, consider how technological innovation and human bravery combine to shape the outcome of one of America's most complex conflicts. The electronic warfare specialists who flew wild weasel missions represented the cutting edge of military science, applied to age-old problems of protecting friendly forces and defeating enemy defenses. Their legacy lives on in every precision-guided weapon, every electronic warfare system, and every successful mission that benefits from the electromagnetic dominance they fought to achieve. The invisible victories won by pilots like Captain Pearson and Lieutenant Garrison established American advantages that continue to protect military forces and save lives around the world today. Please consider subscribing to this channel and sharing this video to honor the memory of those who gave their lives in service of innovations that continue to protect American forces and allies around the world. Their invisible victories deserve recognition, their sacrifice demands remembrance, and their legacy of courage under impossible circumstances continues to inspire those who serve in the defense of freedom and democracy today.